Yeah, so I'm going to be speaking about the effects of food on the brain, and actually you can take a look to this picture that appeared in The Economist a few years ago, despite the effect of the foods on the brain. Basically, this is a brain, and the places which are very important for a cognitive function is in it. There is some type of good food, seafood. Actually, I'm going to be talking about the effect of seafoods in the brain as well. And the most important thing about this publication in The Economist is that it provides to you an idea that you may also be aware of this, isn't it? How important is food for science and society? If we are thinking that the food can have some effects on cognition, for one thing, you can imagine the health aspect of food and also the political aspect of food. I mean, you can imagine, isn't it, that everyone has to eat something, isn't it? It's an event that happens practically every day. And if you accept that food can have some effects on cognitive function or emotions or whatever, just one example. I mean, we know that the elections, for example, in the United States are won by 1% of the population or 2% of the population. If we accept that food can have some type of effect, isn't it, on cognitive function, you can imagine, isn't it, what type of repercussion can have for society and politics. So in these terms, I think it's so important to look at the effect of foods, and several of the speakers already made the point, isn't it, how important has become food during biology and evolution. So the only thing what I want to say here, isn't it, that one of the very, very important reasons why food became very important for the brain, or I would say the opposite, how the brain became very dependent on food, is energy. So there was a moment that there had to be a transition, isn't it, in order to compete for the environment between a small brain and a bigger brain. And we know that, isn't it, that the structural material to make this brain and also energy efficiency was so important. Particularly that happened, isn't it, in biology, that always there are an energy crisis. And when I think about this, I think about these days, isn't it, that the energy is a problem in the world, and we are trying to save energy in many different ways. So we have had hybrid cars, isn't it, that they can consume less fuels and they can produce more efficient transportation. The same type of problem happened to the brain, isn't it, that we have to come up with a better brain, much more efficient in terms of energy. At the same time, we have the cognition. In order to compete for the environment, the brain just not have to be bigger, isn't it? Had to be better. It had to be the one that they conquest the environment. They have to make a better decision than the rest of the species at the time, isn't it, in order to be successful. So, so the point there is that the energy and structural material have become very important, and these have been provided by the high quality food. And also locomotion. Tomorrow the exercise is going to be discussed, and exercise as well, isn't it, has played a very important role in the effects of the environment on the brain. So for one thing, now food, we are starting to understand how important it is for disease prevention, mental health, quality of life. And I'd like to say a few words, isn't it, about how this can happen in terms of the mechanistic terms. So basically, I'm going to be discussing this model, isn't it, because we have been discussing in the meeting already that we need to make many decisions in terms of food choices. And so basically, every day, isn't it, we are balancing, isn't it, we eat something bad, at the same something good. So the question is, isn't it, how this can affect the brain. And I've been working on this model, for example, using omega-3 fatty acids in animals, models, also using diets which are high in saturated fat and sugars that they're supposed to be not as good for the brain. So the question is how we can balance this. So first I'm going to be discussing the effect of caloric diet on the brain. And has been discussed already, isn't it, that there has become a big problem in the last 30 years. Already the concept of obesity and epidemic was already discussed. We also know these days, for example, diabetes, like 40% of the population in the United States has some type of diabetes. So the question is, isn't it, what type of implication this diabetes and all of these metabolic disorders can have for the brain? As we know today, so for one thing, first, I am going to be discussing the effect of sugar in the brain. Also it has been discussed, isn't it, the consumption of sugars have become a big problem, isn't it, because there is an excessive use of sugars in many foods. And another thing is this high fructose corn syrup, isn't it, that is highly being consumed in many beverages and most of the type of foods. So then for one thing, we started studying the effect of sugar in the brain, isn't it? The concept of metabolic syndrome, you know, has been known for many years. However, most of the people actually, they have been thinking that when we are discussing metabolic syndrome is exclusive to the body. And however, I'd like to show you some evidence that they also can affect the brain. So we have done some experiments in animals, isn't it, exposing animals to consumption of fructose, 15% of fructose for 6 weeks. So for one thing first, we found that has been found before, isn't it, that looking at, for example, the levels of insulin resistance, which is one of the hallmarks of this metabolic syndrome, certainly occurs in the body as we expected. So later on, we start looking at further in this model, and we start putting the animal to cognitive tests. For example, this, isn't it, is a test to look at the learning and memory in animals. And basically what we found that the performance on the animals in the test was very dependent on the levels of insulin resistance. In other words, the animals that they have high levels of insulin resistance, they perform worse in the test, which actually gave to us some idea, isn't it, that there could be some interaction between metabolic syndrome and brain. So later on, we started studying a few other things. One of them was the signaling through the insulin receptors in the brain. And we found basically that in the animals that have been exposed to the high fructose, where they behave worse in this type of test. So anyway, as I mentioned to you, in these experiments, we combined these two types of diets. One was the fructose in the drinking water, and the basic diet had 2 levels of omega-3 fatty acid. Some of them had no omega-3, and the other one has adequate levels of omega-3. So I am saying here, isn't it, that the animals that they show the most problem, isn't it, in insulin resistance were the animals that they have been exposed to high fructose and no omega-3. And we look at many other markers, and basically we found, isn't it, that a lot of markers which are very important for the transmission of information across cells. This is a synapse, which actually is very important. Most of the events related to learning and memory occurs in this structure. So basically, there is information, isn't it, that they have to be transmitted from one cell to the next in order to be processed. And a lot of the learning and memory events actually occurs in this structure. So the information that is being transmitted across the synapse is very important. And I am telling to you that the high sugar diet combined with the low omega-3 make the situation very difficult. So some of the explanation is here in the cartoon. Some of these main elements, what can be. For one thing I told you already, isn't it, that energy and metabolism is something very important, and here is represented by the mitochondria. Another thing is this membrane, omega-3 fatty acid, which are found in membrane. So all cells in the brain are surrounded by a plasma membrane. Isn't it? This the layer of cells, and very important for everything. So practically, and I am very categorical about this, practically everything that occurs in the brain occurs across this cell membrane. So basically, in the synaptic structure, the receptors are embedded in the membrane here. So in order for information to be transmitted from one cell to the next, they have to stimulate these receptors, and for any reason the membrane doesn't perform well, the information is not going to be transmitted properly. So, and in these terms, is something very important point that I'd like to make here. Isn't it? Here we are dealing with two things together. I already mentioned to you the structure of the brain, in this case, would be represented for the contents of omega-3. And also I am telling to you about the energy metabolism. So we know these days that and it has been already mentioned a few times this morning, that about this concept of oxidative stress. So what is happening is when there is an excess of oxidative stress, several of these lipids, like omega-3 fatty acid, which are in the membrane, they become damaged because of the oxidative stress, which is, as I said, is an event which is related to, in this case, an excess of energy. So in summary, the situation is like this membrane becomes dysfunctional, and the signaling cannot be transmitted properly, and the hypothesis here is that the learning and memory and cognition and many emotional process can be affected because of this, and we have done these experiments, isn't it, by measuring molecules, which are very important in order to evaluate the function of the membrane. So anyway, the situation after that becomes more complicated, and I'd like to jump a little bit here, isn't it, to the functional aspects of what I've been telling to you, or mostly, I would say, the practical aspect of the effect of foods on the brain. And in order to test this possibility, we have been working with a model of traumatic brain injury. As you know, traumatic brain injury is something extremely prevalent in many environments, domestic environments, and sport medicine. It has been very important also in terms of the war, isn't it? We know now that the traumatic brain injury, like there is 250,000 soldiers who have been exposed to traumatic brain injury, and now they are coming back from war, isn't it, with post-traumatic stress disorders, increased anxiety, and many things that we are not very well prepared in order to treat. And also that it's estimated that the cost for the country is going to be huge. So anyway, we have been testing the effect of diet on model of traumatic brain injury using an animal model in which there is no direct damage to cells in the brain. So basically, we just throw a fluid, a high-pressure fluid, against the brain of rodents, like in this system here, and we look at several properties in the brain. So this is a very simple experiment that we perform in order to look at how the previous exposure to diet can affect the outcome of traumatic brain injury. And here I am going to be talking, isn't it, about the effect of saturated fat, as you know, it's becoming very prevalent in our population. And actually, I was in Japan a couple of months ago, and they called this hamburger the Big America. Isn't it that it seems that they are blaming in the United States a lot of this saturated fat and a lot of toxicity that which actually, I don't know, they may be correct. Anyway, basically the experiment that I'm going to be talking about, I call also maybe the Asian syndrome experiment, which actually happens a lot in the United States because there are immigrants from countries that they have been eating very well, isn't it, for a while, and later on they come and they are switched to diets high in saturated fat and sugar. It also happened in Northern Europe, isn't it, that the people are changing their diet, isn't it, because of the invasion of fast food restaurants. And basically the experiment here, we have two groups of animals that they were from pregnancy, isn't it, after birth, for many weeks, 21, I mean, actually, the total of, I believe, like 3 months in this diet in omega-3 fatty acid. Later on, they will switch to a diet high in saturated fat, and later on, we perform an injury in the brain, like the one that I already told you. And I am going to be showing to you the results of the experiments. So basically here we have two dietary components. One in red, these are adequate levels of omega-3, and in black are omega-3 deficient animals. And here we have the levels of in animals that they were switched to the high fat, and later on what happened when the injury was provided. So in summary, by looking at several parameters, one of them was the behavioral analysis in this test, which actually measured anxiety-like behavior. We did anxiety-like behaviors in it because of it's known already that the disorders like post-traumatic stress disorders, people exhibit high levels of anxiety-like behavior, and we wanted to have some ideas in it how this diet can interact with this. So basically what we found in summary that the worst animals were the animals that they were in the deficient omega-3 fatty acid diet and they were exposed to high sugar. That's looking at the behavior and also looking at the signaling of molecular systems like these are receptors for a very important molecule called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which have been implicated in learning and memory. People know that the BDNF, even in humans, isn't it that with low BDNF, actually they have problem in learning and memory, say, like in this model. So in summary, this type of diet, isn't it, low omega-3 and high sugar actually can impose a risk for this type of behavior. And we can say the opposite, isn't it, like diets high in omega-3 and also reducing sugars can be protective to the brain. So I'd like to show you a few studies. Since tomorrow, isn't it, there will be a lot of exercise in the lectures. The one experiment actually that provide at least some type of hope for people who frequent a lot of the high caloric food. Isn't it, a few years ago, we performed an experiment testing the effect of this high fat diet in animals. And we found actually that the animal that they had been exposed to high fat, in this case is 1 month, 2 months, and actually we did longer lasting experiment. The animal that they had been eating this high fat were the one that they behaved worse in this learning and memory test, which actually was quite interesting because those days the movie, this Super Size Me, have come out, and they start showing, like in people, the same type of thing happen. And so basically, we did that experiment, but we wanted to know, isn't it, that what could happen if the same animals are exposed to exercise at the same time. And basically, we found that that exercise was good for many different things. Also exercise was able to reduce the deficit in learning and memory in the animals, and also translated in higher levels of this molecule, BDNF, in the hippocampus, which is a very important area for learning and memory. So then but the most interesting that the animals that have been eating this bad diet that were exposed to exercise, this exercise sort of normalized the effect of the animals, as well as increased the levels of the BDNF in the hippocampus. So in summary, at this point, I like to make is the high-calorie diet may reduce the capacity of the brain to resist many challenging conditions. And the exercise actually is something important, isn't it, in terms of reducing these effects. And certainly this have a lot of implications, isn't it, for neurological and psychiatric disorders like depression and many others. So in order to finish, I'd like to say a few words. What are the signals, isn't it, how molecularly we can explain a lot of this, which actually is very important, isn't it? Everyone knows, isn't it, it has been suspected for, let's say, 20 years or longer, even hundreds of years, that food can be very important for the brain. But I can tell you that the scientific community has been extremely skeptical to accept all of these findings, because there had not been any molecular evidence for this. So that has been very important, isn't it, for us as basic scientists, isn't it, to come up with a much more harder science in order to prove this. Basically, we have been trying to contribute to this in terms of doing this, and this was so interesting, because this was I believe, one of the first reviews published in Nature about the effect of foods on the brain. Basically, the idea here is, isn't it, that as I told you already, like energy production is at the center of the equation here, and there are molecules which are very important for a function of the brain, like BDNF, and affecting synaptic transmission, which actually can affect cognitive function. So that's something very important when this mitochondrial energy machinery doesn't work properly. You have problems like oxidative stress, which actually most of you know already what it is, and that can have an effect, isn't it, on cognitive function. And I'd like to say a few words about these epigenetics, because this is maybe the science of the future, isn't it, that they have become very important these days in many different ways. And also, I'd like to say a few words how this can be based on metabolic functions in the brain. So we have performed a few experiments in order to look at hundreds of proteins and genes that can be affected by diet and exercise. And in summary, I can tell you that we have found that most of the genes and proteins that they are activated by exercise, in this case, are metabolic, like the blue one here, or in red, which are plasticity types. And I am talking here about the hundreds of molecules, which something is so important, isn't it, that we need to keep in consideration if we want to make a change in terms of the brain. We need to think in hundreds, isn't it, because the science has been very much directed in having a single molecule to explain many complicated things. So, and to finish, I'd like to say a few words about the future, isn't it, how foods can affect the brain. We have been listening already, isn't it, how important can be evolution, isn't it, for the type of body and brain that we have these days. For one thing, the problem with evolution is most of the findings have been trying to be explained in terms of mutations. Isn't it that mutation in genes, which actually mutations takes hundreds of years to occur, and many of them cannot be easily translated, isn't it, into next generation. It's something that can happen, isn't it, but you need a long span in order to happen. So basically, what is important here that in the last, I would say, 10 years, and even much more in the last few years, we have something called epigenetics or molecular epigenetics that basically we can explain a lot of these things that can happen in terms of at the level of one generation. And there have been several provocative studies, like the one that I am mentioning here, isn't it, that have been performed in humans, particularly in Europe and in Sweden in this case, that you know, in Europe there have been times of famine, and you can follow families across generations. And basically, in this study, for example, that there are more of these, people found that the health of a lot of people actually was very dependent what the grandparents or the grandparents did, isn't it, a few generations ago in terms of the eating. And so that's the significance of this, and I'd like to introduce you a few things about the epigenetics. Something can happen at the level of the genes, at the level of the chromatin, and there are, for example, some modifications called, for example, acetylation, methylation of genes, that basically you don't need to change the sequence of the genes. Basically, you change the conformation of the structure of the genes, and also you change proteins which are attached to the gene. But the most important of these that you can change the function of genes, and some of these can be functional significant. In this very complicated figure, we can drive a few conclusions. This is a cell, and these are the many proteins in the cell. But what is important here, what we have here in this area, these are proteins which are very important for metabolism, energy metabolism. And here we have several of these proteins which can drive epigenetics. So the point that I'd like to make here is that there is a very close association between energy and epigenetic changes that can change everything that we have been discussing now. And this can have incredible implications. For example, people working in cancer, they know already, isn't it, that they're thinking of how we know that diet can affect cancer, for example. But basically the idea that a lot of these molecules, which are important, isn't it, for regulating many functions in the brain, cognitive function and everything, come from this level. And we have been working on this in the lab for a few years on this, in terms of, for example, the effect of diet and exercise on this epigenetic modification. And basically, we are finding that the diet and exercise can promote, for example, methylation of genes like BDNF, that I already mentioned, that is important for cognitive function. And you can read more about that. But basically, and also we are finding that diets like omega-3 fatty acid diet can also promote changes in the methylation of the BDNF gene, which actually can regulate the function of this gene. And from here, isn't it, we can think a lot about the implication for the future. And also, another aspect that you can think about this, isn't it, when we are thinking about food, what I am telling to you, although a lot of the things, isn't it, in terms of food taste, prediction, food addiction, and a lot of these exists, there is a component which is plastic, isn't it, that what it means, because of these events, we may change a lot of these, and actually there can be a lot of learning of taste, and we know that already, isn't it, that we can sort of switch this if we want to do it. I mean, basically, isn't it the type of food that is consumed in Western society, or what the people like in the Western society is different to what they like in the East, isn't it? And so, for example, so anyway, a lot of these can be actually very interesting in terms of looking at this in terms of epigenetics. And just to finish, I'd like to say I just didn't have time to talk about a few food examples, but there are many food types that they have been found to be important for the brain, like turmeric, curcumin, you know, flavonoids. People working in chocolates, isn't it that they seem to be very important for brain function. And to finish, isn't it, and basically what I mentioned already, isn't it the effect of diet, isn't it on cognitive function, and also protecting against neurological disorders. However, isn't it by not balancing the diet very well, isn't it the situation can become very unhealthy. We can develop metabolic syndromes and can reduce cognition. And that can be big problems, isn't it, during aging, isn't it that you know, Alzheimer's disease is a disease that takes 10 years or more to develop. Food can be very important for this, isn't it? And obesity is already mentioned. And basically, isn't it, we understand much better in terms of how food works today than 10 years ago. And I think that's all what I'd like to say. And thanks to my laboratory and the National Institute of Health, they have funded most of these studies.